Hey guys, welcome back to Self-Care Haven. Today I wanted to talk to you about a question that I've received in different variations, and essentially this question is about how do we distinguish between a toxic person and a traumatized one. It's not a black and white sort of affair, right? Because we have a lot of layers to unravel when we're thinking about the distinctions between a toxic narcissistic individual, someone who's possesses the full-fledged personality disorder of narcissism, or even antisocial personality disorder, or even psychopathy at the very extreme level. And then we have someone who might be acting and operating out of their trauma, might be reacting into situations in a way that is very reminiscent of triggering, being triggered, responding and reacting to a trigger in a way that's maladaptive. So how do we distinguish between that? Think about the ways that you have reacted when you've been triggered. How did you react? Usually it was impulsive, right? Because you were triggered, so you impulsively reacted in a way that was maladaptive. Second of all, you didn't do it as a way to sadistically and in a premeditative way put down someone. You did it because at the time you did not feel safe and someone was saying something mean to you or doing something cruel to you, and you were reacting from your own trauma in your response to them, instead of staying calm and collected and deciding to disengage and walking away from that toxic person, whoever you were interacting with. You decided to stay and engage and further reenact the trauma. And I'm not saying this as a way to blame any victims that have reacted maladaptively to their abuse, because we all know as abuse survivors that we've all had coping mechanisms that were not the best, and that's okay. I mean, that's what happens when you've been traumatized, and that's perfectly okay. You can validate yourself, you can empower yourself. This is just a discussion about how we can easily become triggered when we are in a toxic environment like that. So again, the distinction is that when you are being re-triggered and re-traumatized by something and you react maladaptively to it, it often comes across as very impulsive, and it is in fact impulsive. It's very organic in the way that it arises, whereas a toxic person will premeditate, they will plan, they will execute. Sometimes their rage is impulsive, but it's also a performative sort of rage. It's a rage that they feel very justified and entitled to, whereas a triggered person, someone who has been traumatized, someone who may have picked up on toxic behaviors due to their childhood programming or even programming by an abusive relationship in the early adulthood, can easily become very triggered and incredibly impulsive in the way that they react to others if they don't have that sort of centeredness that brings them back to a sense of control over themselves and this inner calm and inner guidance as to how to react to a toxic situation in a way that's not maladaptive, in a way that is able to disengage the abuser or whoever is triggering you, is able to walk away and is able to implement low contact or no contact, is able to not take the projections of others seriously, is able to detach from gaslighting, detach from projection, detach from triangulation, and is very rooted in their own truth. So when we think about a toxic person, on the other hand, who's on the warpath, who is bullying others and shaming others and trying to silence others for their own agenda, I think that the distinction becomes a little bit more clear. Although an outsider may not be able to distinguish it as easily, whoever's in that toxic interaction with that person has a lot more insight, because they know if whether or not they are being triggered by something, or if they're going out of their way to bully others as a way to feel better about themselves, as a way to elevate themselves, as a way to cater to their own sense of superiority and entitlement. And so if you have someone who's staging personal attacks, not in reaction necessarily to something that they might have experienced in the past, but rather a reason that may seem a little bit irrelevant, they basically went out of proportion. They blew it all out of proportion, and they went over the top, right? And this can be very complicated with complex PTSD symptoms, because we do have emotional flashbacks to those periods of time when we've been helpless, when we felt helpless or hopeless, and that toxic shame that we may have experienced in childhood if we were childhood trauma survivors. But a toxic person who is already disordered, who is used to shaming others, is used to getting that sadistic pleasure out of putting others down and elevating themselves, will operate a little bit more differently. The rage will be less impulsive, the rage will be less premeditated, unless of course you're a borderline, or perhaps you are in the moment experiencing symptoms of complex PTSD that seem like borderline rage. That can be a little bit different, whereas a narcissist will basically provoke you and then sit back and smile, and they'll watch the drama unfold because they thrive in the drama. So although it can be very complicated to distinguish between the two, it's important to think about premeditation, the impulsivity involved. How are they attacking people? Are they going out of their way to stage personal attacks on people that did not do anything to harm them? Are they reacting over the top and then also failing to take accountability? Because a lot of us who have been triggered by people and situations tend to show remorse, apologize, show empathy for any kind of harm we may have caused. If that person did not abuse us and they just re-triggered us somehow, we tend to apologize. We tend to take accountability for actions. We tend to say, hey, sorry, I went over the top. I shouldn't have been so upset about this. This was just really re-triggering for me because I experienced this and that. We take accountability. We are accountable for our actions, whereas toxic people, on the other hand, they rarely take accountability. They justify, they rationalize, they deny, they minimize the impact of the harm that they cause. Whereas a person who is simply re-triggered, who may be experiencing symptoms of complex PTSD, will hopefully often take responsibility for their actions. They will apologize, they will show maybe a shift in perspective, they will be able to ground themselves even after they've been triggered. They will be able to understand that they did play a role in the interaction. Unless, of course, they're in an abusive relationship, whereas in that case, they're not just being re-triggered, they're also being wounded with new injuries, new psychological injuries. I hope this video helps. I hope that it puts into perspective some of the differences and the distinctions, because there is definitely a distinction between a toxic person who's on the warpath, who's seeking to feed their own grandiose ego and to eliminate any sort of threat, and a person who may simply be re-triggered, who may be experiencing an emotional flashback. And obviously when we're experiencing emotional flashbacks, we can go over the top, we can blow things out of proportion, so it's important to acknowledge that, but also to acknowledge that there will be differences in the responses after the behavior has taken place. So if we happen to be re-triggered and responded in a maladaptive way, we will take accountability. A toxic person rarely thinks it's ever their fault. They will never take accountability for their actions. There is, however, a caveat to this. So let's say that you grew up in a toxic environment in childhood. Maybe the way that you react to your abusers is maladaptive and seems very toxic to the outside world, but it's actually a coping mechanism for the toxicity that you've experienced. That is one caveat of this kind of distinction, because that sort of I'm not taking accountability can easily arise in situations where you may have been abused as a child and you realized you are not going to take the blame anymore for your family member's abusive behavior towards you, and you decide that you're not going to accept any sort of abuse. You will stand up to it, and maybe the way that you stand up to it may seem maladaptive to somebody else, but for others, for the people who are actually in this type of toxic environment and interacting with these types of toxic individuals, while the ideal outcome is obviously to disengage and go no contact and low contact, we also have interactions where there might be unavoidable interactions with certain narcissists narcissists in our lives. So that is one caveat of the distinction, because you can react in a way that doesn't take accountability if you are responding to your abuser and you feel like, I'm not going to take the blame for this. I mean, they've been abusing me all this time. However, that does not mean that it's an excuse to abuse anyone. It doesn't mean that you have a free pass to abuse whoever because you've been traumatized. It's not a free pass at all. It just means that maybe you responded maladaptively to a toxic individual who's been terrorizing you, and you don't want to show them that, oh, I'm going to apologize for this and that, when they have not shown you any empathy or compassion in the way that they've abused you. And that's perfectly okay. I will never judge a childhood abuse survivor for doing what he or she needs to do in order to set boundaries, because I know how horrific that experience can be. So that is one caveat. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. What are some of the distinctions? And obviously, with the distinctions, we can also observe that there's differing motivations and intentions. A toxic individual is doing this for their own ego. They're doing this to eliminate any sort of threat that threatens their false mask, that threatens their sense of self, their grandiose sense of self and superiority and entitlement. Whereas a traumatized individual is often experiencing emotional flashbacks, and because they are becoming rewounded, they are organically responding to an emotional threat in a way that may not be ideal and may be maladaptive, but they often take accountability. They're able to understand their role in the interaction, unless, of course, it's an abusive relationship, whereas where the roles, there's obviously a power imbalance. And their rage tends to be less premeditated, more impulsive, and they can, they suffer remorse. They have empathy for, the people that may have experienced them re-triggering this, and may have encountered them in some way, responding in a way that was not ideal, that was not healthy. And I think that's really the core of it, right? The intentions, the motivations, the responses, the behavior afterwards. Someone who goes out of their way on the warpath to stage a personal attacks against you when you've really done nothing to deserve it, or done anything to potentially harm them. That's someone who's toxic. That's someone who really needs to check themselves. That's someone who needs to step back and reevaluate. Whereas a re-triggered person still needs to step back and reevaluate, but it's not part of their chronic pattern. It's not something that has always been their way of thinking and behaving. It's something that's arising due to the traumas that they've experienced. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this. Let me know what you think are the distinctions between a traumatized individual and a toxic one. Sometimes the lines can be very blurred, but I do believe there are ways to figure out how we can distinguish between the two. Let me know some of the similarities that you've experienced, and I hope to talk to you guys very soon. And until then, take care.